On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, I speak with Jason Craig. He is the executive director of Fraternity. He is also the editor-in-chief of Sword and Spade magazine. He's a homesteader. He's an author, and he is one of the speakers at this year's upcoming Chesterton Conference. Hello again, viewers and listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Uncommon Sense. My name is Joe Grabowski, the VP for Evangelization and Mission here at the Society of G.K. Chesterton, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the program one of our speakers for the upcoming 43rd Annual Chesterton Conference outside of Philadelphia, Jason Craig. Jason, how are you?
It's good to be here, Joe. I'm doing well. How are you?
Pretty well. We were talking a little bit before we started recording that I'm in a different orientation than folks are used to seeing me. My back is bothering me a little bit, so I'm at my standing desk. So I hope people don't mind the alternative angle. They're seeing more of the top of my head than usual. So
it's beautiful. Looks great.
So Jason, we met briefly at the Prairie Troubadour Summit earlier this year down in Fort Scott, Kansas, and I got to hear you on a little panel there about sort of homesteading and ruralism as a value, agrarianism. And my understanding is that you do a lot of writing and work on that. So perhaps for the listeners who are unfamiliar, just introduce yourself, your work, and your lifestyle to the audience.
Sure. Well, you mentioned I work for an apostolate called Fraternity, and that's actually, I've been working with them for since 2008. And part of that is kind of an apostolate, or not kind of, it's an apostolate that helps men find ways to mentor the next generation, or to put it differently, bring the next generation of boys into the world of men, right? Whereas most, youthy things, youth groupy things, right? How do we reach youth today? And we basically propose that's not the problem. I mean, if you can't reach youth, they live in your house. You can't reach anyone. We would actually just reframe the problem as that they're not reaching us, right? They're not becoming one of us as men. We're not initiating them into our world. So that apostolate of Fraternity, obviously, it deals with men and boys. And I was in grad school studying, why is this a problem? Why didn't past generations have, men's groups? And so they just didn't. And eventually you come up against the Industrial Revolution, and you come up against the distributists in Chesterton and their writings on the family. And actually it was, John Senior and the distributists and all that, reading that around, 2010 and 11. I said, I grew up somewhat rural, definitely kind of blue collar, and we had our third baby, and we were living in downtown Denver, or not down. We were living in an apartment in Denver, and I just said we've got to live on a farm, So I think every family at some point says that to themselves, and more or less runs into disaster. So we ran headlong into it, went back to our home state of North Carolina, and we've been homesteading since then, and just, you don't want to throw out your bona fides here, but we're pretty serious about it. We have dairy. I mean, we've been dairying this whole time. So if you're milking a cow every day, if you're milking a cow on Christmas morning, that's how you know you're a little bit, you're committed. So we've been doing that for about 12 years. And now I've written a book in the last year called Liturgy of the Land, Cultivating Catholic Homestead. And that was with my friend Tommy, and that was trying to distill not the story of our move to the land or anything like that, but actually just sort of recognizing that we're the prince. A lot of people want to move. They have that idea, or they have the idea of localism, ruralism, and agrarian. All these things kind of get mixed up. It's kind of one idea, and there's a good reason. There are distinct things, but there's just sort of this, for lack of better words, how do we get back to a village? Just whatever we're doing now isn't working. So different isms, but that book recognizes that we're not formed in agrarian. We're not formed by a world where the land and its seasons and its ways are really paramount to our culture, or the family is the center of the economy, or we just don't live in that world. So we presume we can just we'll just, start a farm, and we'll just overlay homesteading onto our normal suburban way of life. And that doesn't work. So we wrote the book as recognizing there's really a conversion that has to take place. the magazine Sword and Spade has been a labor of love with a group of friends that are, basically recognizing things like the loss of productive home, the loss of local community, the loss of these things is really going to be, it's not going to be recovered by sloganeering on the internet, right? Or really it's not going to be recovered on the internet, period. We'll just put it that way. So it's kind of a hyper-localist, Catholic, household-based magazine. And I think, it's very, we have everything. The joke is we have theologians and mechanics because they both need each other, the kind of union of the working man and the wisdom that he has, and then the intellectual tradition of the church. We just don't have a lot of there's so little interaction between those worlds. I think the life and wisdom that is gained from men that have the responsibility of households and work and labor just kind of in normal, and they're out there. We don't even see them, but I mean, the mechanics and the plumbers and those guys are really probably have some of the most wisdom out. And then we have the intellectual tradition of the church, which is beautiful. So Sword and Spade is, we kind of want to be a lightning rod between the two, they really exchange. So we'll have everything from, a serious analysis of rap music in the home, because, dads are going to face that question. Like, can my kid listen to Eminem? Mm-hmm. Or, if you own a small business, should you close your shop for a solemnity, Catholic solemnity, if you live in a, predominantly Protestant town, and things like that. That's the magazine. So anyway, that's I don't know if I have 8 kids and a podunk dairy farm that's always a mess, and I don't know if that answers your question. Probably too much.
No, it does. No, that's great. Yeah, lots to think about in what you said there. I was, again, I'm in a different orientation, so I don't even know if it's in the camera shot, but my icon of Dorothy Day has been pointed out on the podcast before by other guests. That's usually over my shoulder, and Dorothy certainly with Peter Maurin had that very same ideal that you're describing with Sword and Spade. That was the idea of the houses of hospitality, where kind of the working class and the intelligentsia could come together and commune and learn from one another, learn wisdom, because it's the great intellectual heritage and tradition of the church is as much for the working man, the man who perhaps didn't even in their day finish grade school, let alone high school, but there's also sort of this learned wisdom, this kind of deeper rooted wisdom, the wisdom of the hobbits of the Shire, that sometimes the great and the mighty in their ivory towers or whatever type of towers they live in, they need that infusion. They need it as well.
Yeah,
so
actually, Peter's phrase, "Every scholar a working man, and every working man a scholar." That is kind of the backbone of Sword and Spade magazine. So we do try to. It actually makes it editorially very difficult because we always have mostly authors from guys in the trenches, as you will, and not professional thinkers, and makes for hard editorial work, but there once you can chisel away, there really is, diamonds in there.
That's great. So I know that, I'm familiar with your work from your previous book. Was it about boyhood, leaving boyhood behind? Is that the title of it? Or
right?
Yeah. So I would recommend that to listeners, and just this, it really lit a fire in my brain about sort of the passage in society from when we had sort of these rites of passage and of inaugurating young men into adulthood, into adult life, and kind of welcoming them. And maybe say a little bit more about that, because I don't think we hear it enough about this. When you gave your talk at the Prairie Troubadour, for example, you spoke about how teenagers don't really exist, sort of like there is no class, or ought not exist. Yeah, maybe say a little bit more about that for the audience.
Yeah, that's is next to, and really, it threaded through my love for agrarianism and all things, kind of connected to local culture and land, is the fact that a byproduct of just the modern order, and that's the economic order, the social order, is that we have invented adolescence and we perpetuate it with the very, the economic and the very model of life that we live, which is based on amusement. Everyone's trying to work the least, make the most money, with the ultimate goal of being retired, which is a non-productive consuming unit, which is also a teenager. It's this non-productive consuming unit. That's been or we won't call a person a unit, but my fascination with the anthropology of how do people receive the gift of who they are, right? Because no one's really self-made, and even in the church, right? You can't. Your conversion might be very personal, but you have to be baptized, and you can't baptize yourself. Priests cannot absolve themselves. There's this need to be brought into a body, and that's how boys became men. And and this isn't. If people think this is some weird machismo idea, it's not. I mean, it's right there in Scripture. When St. Paul is very clear. When I was a boy, I acted like one, and then I became a man. Which for him, in the context of 1 Corinthians 13, he's talking about I learned how to love people, right? And not just affection, but real serious sacrificial love. So leaving boyhood behind was my sort of taking the anthropological idea of a rite of passage, which was, studied mostly by anthropologists. And what they were studying is how do people make someone who's on the outside one of them? And they explored, how does a religious order, for example, take someone who's not one of them and make them, initiate them? How does the church initiate? The church uses the language of initiation. How does a military initiate a new recruit? You don't just become these things, right? You can't just walk in and sign a membership card. There's certain things that require initiation, like marriage, right? You don't just walk in together and walk through your apartment and go, well, now we're a married couple, right? I mean, a lot of people try that and it's not working. So leaving boyhood behind was the anthropology of that, specifically as what most of us think of when we hear a rite of passage, which is boys becoming men. And the reason most of us think of that is out of all the rites of passage, it's somewhat for society, seems to be one of the most necessary. That one of the worst things a culture can do is allow their boys to stay in boyhood. Boys are innocent, right? A child cannot be childish, right? A child is a child, and it's good. A man can be childish, right? That's why, in that which case he's really not being a man. So I know a man. So there's all sorts of things out there, and honestly, I'm a little exhausted by the constant man talk and everything. But there is a way to define it, to understand that a man is as a boy who has grown up, right, and has learned to love and sacrifice. And the way that we initiate boys into manhood is to pull them out of boyhood, put them through their initiation, and then they join us as men. They become us. In our society, because the first problem is that there is no us, right? There is no healthy fraternity amongst men. There is no path and no initiation, no challenge that boys have to prove them. We're even uncomfortable saying a boy needs, well, they don't have to prove themselves. Absolutely. A man has to prove himself every day. Of course they do. And it's not just for us, it's for them. They need to be shown what they're capable of, right? And the fact of the matter is it doesn't happen by natural development like it does for girls. Mm-hmm. Girls tend to mature more naturally. The biology of the body, the reality of what their body goes through is significantly changes and orients them, and they actually become like their mothers, in motherhood and mothers, even, no matter how politically correct we get or loopy or woke, whatever the word is, everyone the world of children is overseen by women. It's just how it is. I mean, if you were to drop off your, a 7-year-old boy at a daycare and a bunch of college guys came out and said, yeah, we'll take care. I mean, you wouldn't even trust them, right? It's still overseen by women. So the girls grow up naturally in that environment. They become more mature. They become like the women. I mean, they serve more naturally. They take care of it. Now I know they become vicious. I mean, there's few species as vicious as a middle school age girl, but boys on the other hand do not mature unless someone intervenes and matures them. Right? This is like a rite of passage is done to them. It is not going to happen by degrees. And there's a crisis in adolescence that occurs naturally with this sort of moment of, who am I? Am I going to meet the challenge of manhood? And it's the men that provide the challenge. And they guide them through. It's not as if, if you don't do this, you're not in. I mean, there were some cultures that were that harsh. But typically it's the men that are guiding them. It's God wrestling with Jacob. It's not because he wanted to fight. He was teaching him, and he was going to bring him through this, right? And expressed his love by breaking his hip. We now, I mean, part of the crisis right now of the LGBTQ, especially the transgender stuff, is just, I mean, a boy comes to the end of his boyhood. He goes, who am I? What am I? Looking like becoming a man looks really hard and challenging. And somebody might say, well, maybe because you're not a man and you can become a woman, right? And he can overnight become a hero. And I know that's a very complicated issue, but it's, something was being proposed. So anyway, the leaving boyhood behind, and this is like kind of the method of fraternists, which is why it's hard for us to describe what we do, because most people just think in the paradigms of youth groups and youth ministries, and it's just like, that's just not the problem. We are, first of all, a brotherhood of men trying to bring boys into that and challenge them, just through teaching them the virtues and, doing crazy things like fasting together. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that is how we would frame the problem.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And, I've done a lot of reading and thinking about this, and a little bit of speaking over time, and just chatting with friends too about, this issue. And on the one hand, you do have, as you kind of alluded to, there is this very, very disturbing culture of, let's call it it's hyper masculinism, but not hyper manhood. I would say, like there is a sense in which the masculine is devoid or is separate from manhood as such, and I think this is part of the point. So that's out there online. Yeah, and it's very dangerous. But I think the importance of distinguishing this, lest anyone get the harebrained idea that there is anything misogynistic, it's actually quite the reverse. That if you want misogyny to sort of dominate in a society, you allow males that are physically mature males to be emotional boys, and that's where you're going to have many, many more problems for men and women in society, but especially for women and girls in society, when you have that disconnect between the physical capability and the emotional maturity. And so really the stakes of the issue couldn't be overstated,
Yeah, because the extremes we're bringing up, actually, rites of passage is meant to solve both of those extremes, which is like the brute and the brat, right? The guy who walks in the room passively with his head down, scared of the world, scared of his own shadow, might be just as insecure as the man who walks in the room and has to prove to everyone around him that he's stronger, faster, better, and will beat you up, right? Or is capable. Like, so the bully and the wimp are kind of the same problem, which is a man who is secure in himself doesn't do either one of those things. He doesn't have to go in every room swinging, and he also does. It's this very simple word we call confidence, right? And he walks in capable. He's confident. He knows, and this is an identity. I understand who I am. I don't have to, prove myself in that sense anymore. I know who and that actually these issues of this might sound, distant from listeners that might be accustomed to talking of like Chestertonian terms of distributus and local things and jolly old hobbits running around. That form of security that a man ought to have comes from his local place. That's where it exists. So I mean, these online influencers that telling the men how to be, it's absurd. I've got a man, he's a fellow homesteader, Jim Curley, and when he speaks, he comes in, he helps us kill pigs, and like when he's an old guy, he's raised kids, he's done the work. He's not that old if he's listening, and he's done the work of raising a family. He's done the work of homesteading. He does it. He's done it. And when he sits and speaks, he's got nothing to prove to anyone. And the young men, whenever we have these little homestead conferences, they gather around him. The young dads, those guys are just starting their family, and they recognize, I want to be like Jim, right? So when you have a local culture, you have a way for Jims, right, to make you one of them through fraternity with them. Right. These are hard things for us to even grasp, because we're going to bring up, the online examples of these guys, and it's so laughable. So anyway, no, I agree with you. Because a boy is fundamentally insecure. He enters the world insecure, and he kind of goes through life insecure. And the point of initiation is to secure him. And that's in virtue and culture, right? It's not in self-branding or finding your way or your path. It's virtue is the best word because it insinuates that there is a potential in you that is already there, that's natural and native, that needs to just be perfected, right, and grown and secured in its ability. And that's what we're talking about here. So I agree. It's really hard to have the conversation because people are so put off by the machismo thing. Although I think that's probably overblown. Honestly, I'd rather listen to those guys than the guys that want men to just keep their head down and, their tail between their legs. Yeah. But anyway, they're just two extremes. Hopefully, read Leaving Boyhood Behind, right? There's a second edition coming out where I try to describe a little bit more of those extremes and why they manifest and why they're so irritating to us. But the real irritant, of course, because both of them are is annoying teenagers. What we really need to do is get rid of teenagers. Yep. We can have men, we can have boys and men, but we just got to stop allowing the teenagers to run society.
Yeah. And increasingly they are, sadly. Yeah. It's, for the audience too, to just connect it. If you do think, what's Chesterton have to say towards this? I think quite a lot. His whole economic theory, his and Belloc's, right? And this is important for people to realize because it will use some of the same terminology, especially in Belloc, of alienation and things like that you'll hear in Marxist discourse. And we maybe have rightfully a suspicion immediately when we start hearing terms like it's almost an allergy, right? Because certainly socialism and communism were dangerous, deadly ideologies. But when they speak about this alienation, I think what's important is that, as you said, virtue is sort of this. Every man has a horizon of achievement in his life, and he's being called towards it. And yet, what they complained against was that you put a guy on an assembly line, there's no telos. That, like, if the telos of what he's doing is a car, and now he's divorced from the car, he's just building a fender or a pipe that he doesn't know how it fits into the whole process. There's a constraining of his potential, and that's just one example. So this it relates socioeconomically, but also against the whole machismo thing. I mean, one of the ways Chesterton, I would argue, did this in his own life was as a boy when he was in his teenage years. So not as a teenager, as a boy becoming a man in those years. He and his friends founded the Junior Debating Club, and they wrote articles, and they argued, and they intellectually engaged one another in the world, and they wrote poetry, and they memorized and recited poetry. And those too are achievements that we have a capability for. So you don't have to go to the extreme of, lift more weights or run the ball faster or harder or whatever. It could be commit a big chunk of great epic poetry to memory, and then stand up and berate your friends with it. That's that's kind of the that's just as much a model of masculinity as some of the more stereotypical things, and it doesn't participate in sort of that caricature of it.
Yeah, but in both of those examples, whether it is pushing the ball forward or having a debate, I'm always like I would love if more men would just argue in person. That would be great,
yeah.
But in both of those cases, what you're actually discovering is where you belong. You have a group of people to whom you belong, and you're interacting with them. And this is why that sort of localist impulse is not some strange bumper sticker ideal. It's where you work out in fear and trembling. You're before God and man, right? The reality of who you are. When you have this sort of endless pool of nothingness that is like, I don't know, the online world, or these endless ideas of who am I going to be, or I mean, my wife always talks about when she was, with this, when we were in high school together, we were pre-social media and all that stuff, but she'd go to the mall and it's like, well, what brand am I going to be? Am I going to be a Abercrombie girl? This is just like this endless thing that's formed by either commercialism or just someone else from the outside in pulling you into some self-brand or something, versus really having a local culture that you want, that has its own music and way of life. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine that in some places because of what the Front Porch Republic guys call the mass culture. Just everything is mass produced and giant, and there is no local. So in some ways, the rites of passage and maturity and it just, so much of what actually makes us human requires localism. It requires that we recognize where we are. And I'm actually, I did, sorry, last book plug, I promise, because I only have 3, but I wrote a book on Aquinas, like a study for men, But as I was going through Aquinas, I was actually, it's weaved in there. I was fascinated with how virtue itself requires localism. It requires, like, the way you grow in virtue. Like, just think of something like, I don't know, love your neighbor. What if that meant love your neighbor, right? All of a sudden, the gospel is unavoidably localist.
Yeah.
And then Aquinas, when he talks about things like shame and in the context of temperance, he's constantly referring to, like, the way you sense your life, your character around the people with whom you're forced to live. Because he's presuming, like most of humanity forever, that you're going to have to live with these people for a while, and you're bound to them. Versus, you were bringing up, our fear of them, like, as if it's a Marxist idea that we're atomized away from each other, and long before communism, there was just communion, right? That we commune with one another. Anyway, so virtue requires, in so many instances through these, as I was looking at them, he's just presuming that you're with people, consistently the same people, and not just with them for social reasons, but practical, economic, spiritual, and social reasons. You're with these people, and that's where your virtues are either being cultivated or your vices.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's significant in Aquinas' treatment of the virtue of charity, right? That he devotes this really huge section. Like, he deals with charity in sort of its vague generalities. He doesn't really investigate into subspecies, but for one, which is fraternal correction. And then he has a lot to say about fraternal correction.
Yeah.
And some would argue, well, that's because he's writing for religious houses and monks in this theological textbook. I don't think so. I think he thinks that this is how society should function. We actually do care about one another's growth in the life of virtue and call each other out. And if that's not happening, if you're reading that and you're thinking, I can't imagine, calling out a friend for whatever the language he's using or the habits he's forming, then you need to revisit what it means to really love your neighbor, because right. I think you may be failing in that. And it also reminds me.
Yeah, he has a lot of advice about, and I think actually I think if I recall, most of his advice around fraternal correction, he talks about what's your station, and the example is he uses his fatherhood multiple times. Like, if you're because his basic advice is be very slow to correct. If it's not your job or you're not protecting someone or you won't be received, be really slow. But if you're a father or a friend or something, like, you have sort of an obligation. And then it
also presumes
sorry, go ahead.
Community, right? It also presumes community, that whatever your station in life, even if, whatever your station in life, that you and those that are your peers have some shared structure of authority to which you both, like, this is all part of a cohesive model, and we've lost so much of that. Like, to whom would we appeal? How do we follow, the advice in the Gospels and in the book of James, that if our brother sins, take him to the church, right? What does that look like in practical life? Sorry for stepping over you there.
No, I was going to. We threw Aquinas into the ring, and now we're both excited. It's okay. But mercy, when he's under charity, when he also talks of mercy, this is another spot where just localism hit me. He says that he says mercy. He calls it the sum total of the Christian life, which is like, wow, that's basically if you're being merciful. And what does he mean by, we toss around that word mercy. It's very in vogue right now, and it just means, I don't know what it means to a lot of people. But so for Aquinas, it means that you fill or the deficit of your brother. Like, whatever he is lacking, you fill it. And that's not just like, of course, if he's hungry, you give him a sandwich. But the way he describes it is, we're all imperfect and in need of someone else to fill us. And that is what community is. So how can we live the sum total of the Christian life, be merciful, if we don't even know what the other person needs, right? And how do we come to know what we need? Is that we're with people. And this means so much more than just companionship and friendly sociability and enjoying one another's company. It really deals in the practicals. When you're reading through Aquinas, there are the higher forms, right? These spiritual, intellectual goods, but then that trickles on down because we're body and soul. But he presumes localism in charity because you're filling the needs of others. And how do you know the needs of others if you're not with them? So if we compare that to, like, let's say you had some money you wanted to give away and you start Googling nonprofits. Well, first of all, you should just give to Fraternus. But it's you get this like
And the
endless
Chesterton Society.
and Chesterton
Yeah.
Society split it. But
Yeah.
you just have these endless options, right? I need to do good. Versus like if I'm where I'm sitting right now, I have, you know, we're on our little farm and we have these neighbors, and like I know what their needs are, you know, like and that I told my wife the other day, we came home the other day helping somebody do something. It's so liberating to know what I'm supposed to do for God, right? Because if he says love your neighbor and be merciful, and I know what their needs are, and I do that, I'm pretty sure I'm close to being in perfect discernment. I don't need some mystical vision of what I'm supposed to do to please God. He's over there, you know. It's the drunk guy that needs to borrow a 20. He's my favorite neighbor, by the way.
Yeah, it's you think of the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? And the two motions that the Samaritan does, and they're both really important, right? Because first he goes over to the man and he greets him, he washes out his wounds and anoints them with oil, and then he takes him into the innkeeper, because there's an inn right there, and he gives him some money and instructs him to be taken care of. And it's so fascinating because you don't really get the sense, like if you're just following the story as it unfolds as a narrative, of course it's a great story because look who wrote it, right? Or look who authored it, I should say. You don't know there's an inn there, and then all of a sudden there's this inn, and it kind of comes out of left field. But I think it's probably in some ways the most important point of the story, and the way it surprises you is important because all along you realize that any of the three passing by, including the Samaritan who comes last, could have simply gone into the inn and said, "Hey, you got a guy out there. Here's some money. Take care of him."
Right.
And I don't think that would have fulfilled the call to neighborliness that the whole parable is about. I think it is about both of those activities. First, he has to have the actual one-on-one encounter. You know, this is why GK famously said, you know, philanthropists, in his opinion, were actually misanthropes because philanthropy, you know, loved this vague thing called mankind, but hated men, you know? And there's something really... There's a lot of philanthropic work today that I think fits that paradigm to a T.
Yeah, the you bringing up the inn is, and like the practicality of that act. The thing that blows me away when you're like, well, I'm a convert, so there's things in Scripture, you know, that you don't see when you're a Protestant, like the church is the pillar and bulwark of truth, or. But I'm amazed that I don't think we see in the New Testament that almost the entire book, all the books, all 20, is about taking care of one another practically. I mean, you get advice on like stop suing one another. I was there helping you build tents. Make sure you give some money to this guy when he comes. Like, it's this thing about practical love. And also, I know we have in the church right now, it's very like in vogue to talk like we're all missionaries, right? Of course it's true. We're all supposed to share the gospel, if that's what we mean by that. But in our head, there's a reason, like we use the phrase missionary to be someone who leaves and goes to distant lands, right? Which is why they usually and historically would have been, religious and celibates and priests. And I'm not to say that laymen couldn't do it, but there's a reason you don't have like a lot of examples of like heroic, you know, the North American martyrs it's like Father Isaac Jogues. It would have been the same if it's like, you know, Jason Craig and his wife got their fingers chewed off by the savages or something. But in the early, I'm sorry, my point is when he writes these letters in the New Testament, which the New Testament primarily made up of letters, as St. Paul, this missionary who's out preaching the gospel in all these places, when he writes back to them, the overwhelming presumption of these places is that those people aren't going anywhere. So you better start learning how to live within this new society, which is the church. And it's complicated for you because you've got Jews and Greeks and this is a complex new society, but it's a real society. It's called the church. The church is a real society. And now I'm telling you who to take care of. First, the household of God, your fellow parishioners. And then, as much as you're able, be at peace with all men. But first, the household of God. And then there's all this practical advice, not just in Acts where they're, you know, holding things in common, which people think of, but I mean, just think of 1 Corinthians, like that whole book, just trying to, you know, settle all these scores. And, the advice to Timothy that Paul gives, so, of how to sort of deal with older guys and younger guys, and don't let them despise your youth. And it's just, and then the book of James, like, what do you mean you're patting your brother on the back, but you're not giving him a coat when he's cold? What kind of jerk are you? So anyway, the New Testament is these letters written to people presuming that they have to learn how to live with one another in charity, and basically take care of one another. Don't be a jerk. Don't be a scandal. And when you do that, eventually we get these beautiful things like Catholic villages in Christendom, right? And it took a long time to work out. And a lot of us are just trying to claw back, and we don't need to think of ourselves as missionaries. Like, I got to figure out where I'm called to go. It almost orients you into this abstract outwardness that sort of whatever you do, you get to say, well, God called me to that because I felt, versus like the really hard work of like loving your own family. I mean, it's like, that can be really hard work, or your local community, and taking care of them, not just affectionately, but practically. How do we do that now? How do we practically take care of one another?
Yeah. And to just recognize that motive force that, as Chesterton again says, forget what book it's in, but, Rome was not great. Men did not love Rome because she was great. She became great because men had loved her. And that idea of, he brings that up a lot, the idea of loving, you love the beloved in a certain sense into being as you're building up your own ideal in the other. And that's how all our Christian relationships are. This is why Aquinas picks up on this idea out of Aristotle that the friend is the other self, another self, and we're kind of engaged in this project of co-construction of one another, co-creation of one another. So, well, Jason, we're almost at the end of our time, and it's been a great discussion. Just why don't you let our listeners know, we mentioned the initiatives you're involved in, but what about like websites? Where can they find you if they're interested?
Sure. I mean, if they want to keep in touch, these kind of discussions, the Peter Marin type, the Sword and Spade magazine would be a great quarterly magazine. It's kind of secretly oriented, mostly towards men, without being like man stuff, because we let the wives read it too. And the occasional child. But I would love, we're having if you are interested in localism in the form of agrarianism, and we're having a Liturgy of the Land conference, and other initiatives, and that will be December 13th and 14th. You go to liturgyoftheland.com, and we've got really some great homesteaders and farmers from around the country, and the thrust of that is not to get enthusiastic. That's easy. It's easy to watch some YouTube videos and get like, oh, we should be, it's easy. We can get food out of dirt. It's actually more of a discernment, especially for couples and families. Like, what's the next step, which might be get back to your cubicle and get to work and quit. That might be the answer. But so heavy discernment, community, some of the solid principles that you really need to think through before you do that. But so swordandspade.com, and then Fraternus, of course, and Liturgy of the Land if you're interested in homesteading.
Great. Well, we will have all those links down in the show notes so that people can find them, and I do encourage you to go check them out, buy Jason's books. If you want to wait, I hope, Jason, you'll have some of your books available for sale at our conference, at your table there. And you can come and meet Jason. So if you're not signed up for this great conference at the end of July outside Philadelphia, we were saying, Philadelphia, that's the airport you're flying into, but the conference itself is outside Philadelphia. So if you see Philadelphia on the news and that scares you a little bit, you're not in Philadelphia for this conference. You're actually near the very bucolic setting of Valley Forge. It's quite a nice place. I encourage you to come out and get to meet. Oh, I am. Trust me. You get to meet Jason. You get to meet his fellow author contributors to this great book on localism that Dale Ahlquist helped edit. It's just called Localism. We'll have that for sale, and we're going to have a big book signing event with all of the contributors who are there, both the ones engaging in the panel discussion and others that will be present at the conference. So that's a great opportunity to have this really nice keepsake volume. It's a nice hardcover book from Sophia Institute, so I encourage you to come and get that. You'll be able to buy more of Jason's books, and you'll get to meet him and other speakers and have great discussions like the one we had today. For that discussion, Jason, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Joe. It's been great.
And thank you, viewers and listeners. Please stay tuned. Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, leave us a comment. All that helps the algorithm know that this content's interesting. It shares it to more people. Hit the subscribe button. We have a lot of live events on our channel. Some are impromptu, and you'll get notified every time we go live, so you get to engage in things like our Everlasting Man online book club. You can learn about all those things at our website. But please do share this podcast with your friends. We're trying to grow our audience because, as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. Until next time, God bless.